Chapter 2. A History of Addiction. I have absolutely no pleasure in the stimulants in which I sometimes so madly indulge. It has not been in the pursuit of pleasure that I have periled life and reputation and reason. It has been the desperate attempt to escape from torturing memories, from a sense of insupportable loneliness and a dread of some strange impending doom. Edgar Allan Poe. Chapter 2. A History of Addiction. The first emergency room we tried wouldn't admit me, claiming they didn't treat junkies. Although my mother had been trying for months to get me to accept help, she had been caught by surprise when I finally agreed to it. She didn't know where to take me, immediately ruling out one of the local hospitals. My youngest sister worked there as a candy striper, and my mom didn't want her to be embarrassed by my condition. I wound up at what was then known as Community General Hospital of Sullivan County, with which accepted me into a 7-day detox program. I lay on a gurney, shaking and crying, holding my mother's hand. At some point, I was given a shot that seemed to have no effect. The nurse wouldn't say what it was. I later learned that I'd been injected with naloxone, an opioid antagonist that is merciful when used to revive overdose victims but slightly sadistic for someone already in withdrawal, as it can intensify the symptoms. It works as an antidote, removing any remaining opioid drugs from the receptors. It is the same drug now being made available to addicts, their loved ones, and police officers to reverse overdose, and this way of using it undoubtedly saves lives. I guess the therapeutic rationale for administering naloxone in detox was the theory that this would more rapidly remove the drugs from my system. The punitive one is that it increases your distress. Naloxone worsens withdrawal symptoms, and it was given without my consent. Another sign of the paradoxical way addiction is viewed as both a sin and a disease. The idea that addicted people should have the right to informed consent like any other patient wasn't even considered. Though treatment and punishment were supposed to be opposite approaches, in fact, harsh moralistic tactics were the rule, not the exception, when I sought help. And they are still part of treatment experience for most people with addictions. Before I sought help, I'd read about rehabs where addicts were put on the hot seat and dressed down with everyone present ripping into their every flaw and defect, getting in their face and shouting, often spitting on them. I'd heard about such sessions lasting hours without breaks for the bathroom or sleep, about complete lack of privacy, and about relentless attacks aimed at shattering your identity. I'd seen these kinds of programs honored with celebrity charity dinners and featured uncritically in the mainstream media. I knew that they were widely accepted. In fact, fear of the brutal and deliberately humiliating tactics I'd heard about in inpatient addiction treatment had been a big part of why I hadn't tried it earlier. I was, in general, terrified of other people. I used drugs for emotional protection and social comfort. The idea of being made even more vulnerable and broken down as a way to heal addiction seemed like the exact opposite of what I needed. Being the center of inescapable public condemnation with no control over my environment was my idea of hell, not help. I suffered no shortage of shame, self loathing, and guilt. I did not inject cocaine dozens of times a day because I was proud of myself. And for people who are introverted or oversensitive, having no private space or time and being forced into lengthy periods of group activity, even if it is friendly, can feel like torture. If hostile, unremitting personal attacks are focused on you, it's downright traumatic, particularly for those who have been bullied or abused in childhood, which includes a large proportion of people with addictions. One study found lasting psychological damage in 9% of even normal college students who participated in an attack therapy encounter group modeled on one used commonly in drug treatment. The effects on those who are not mentally healthy, of course, are even worse. However, I didn't feel like I had any choice at that point other than to try to get whatever kind of treatment was on offer. I didn't know how history had twisted both my own view of addiction and the way I would be treated for it. The use of mood altering substances probably predates the rise of humans and other primates. Many species deliberately seek intoxicating plants or the alcohol produced in rotting fruits. Cats, big and small, for instance, ingest and roll in catnip for no other discernible reason than pleasure, though it may have been the convenient side effect of killing parasites. Horses will seek out locoweed, which, as the name suggests, make them behave bizarrely, and they'll eat it again even after they have been sickened by it. The stimulating properties of coffee are said to have been revealed when people observed an extra spring in the steps of goats that had eaten plants' beans. Some archaeologists even claim that civilization itself began when humans settled down to grow grain, not because they wanted it for food, but to make beer. Whatever the evolutionary precursors of drug use are, a permanently drug free human culture has yet to be discovered. Like music, language, art, and tool use, the pursuit of altered states of consciousness is a human universal. With access to few al- alternatives, Siberian shamans imbibe reindeer and human urine to maximize the psychedelic yield of Amimeta musicaria mushrooms. The metabolite that is excreted may be stronger than the substance initially ingested. On nearly the opposite side of the world, New Zealanders party with untested research chemicals, synthesized by Chinese chemists. Drug use spans time and culture. It is a rare human who has never taken a drug to alter her mood. Statistically, it is non users who are abnormal. Indeed, today, around two-thirds of Americans over 12 have had at least one drink in the last year. One in five current smokers. In the 1940s and 50s, it was a whopping 67% of men who smoked. Among people ages 21 to 25, 60% have taken illegal drugs at least once. Overwhelmingly marijuana, and 20% have taken one in the past month. Moreover, around half of us could suffer from physical withdrawal symptoms if denied our daily coffee. While Americans are relatively prodigious drug users, topping charts in the use of many substances, we are far from alone in our psychoactive predilections. predilections. Drug addiction, however, is far more rare, typically affecting 10 to 20% of users of the most common substances. With the exception of nicotine in the form of cigarettes, which addicts about one third of those who try smoking. Again, with the exception of tobacco, these statistics are typically consistent across time in national surveys, which compare the number of people who have ever tried a drug with the number who currently use it and meet diagnostic criteria for addiction. They are also consistent in the studies that follow drug users for long periods and in research on the prevalence of various psychiatric disorders, including addictions, in large international populations. Though drug education programs tend to avoid publicizing these statistics, the expert consensus is that serious addiction only affects a minority of those who try even the most highly addictive drugs. And even among this group, recovery without treatment is the rule rather than the exception. Importantly, the idea of addiction itself is also a relatively modern concept. To understand what it really is and how our thinking about it has become so distorted, it's crucial to know a bit about addiction, about the history of this idea, and see how politics and cultural biases have predominated over science in addressing it. My recognition of my own problems with cocaine and heroin was shaped by this troubling history. And only after I learned about the origins of the stereotypes about addiction and drug users was I able to see how much damage they have done. Without taking this history into account, it's hard to understand why we treat addiction the way we do and why to change it. We used to recognize we need to recognize the role of learning. Historically, the word addiction referred to a social relationship of bondage. In Latin roots in Latin root means enslaved by or bound to. At first, what we now call addiction was seen as a voluntary, if inadvisable, choice. The Bible for example, describes a drunkard as a lover of wine. Addiction here is an overindulgence in pleasure, not a joyous compulsion. God sends many sore judgments on a people that addict themselves to intemperance in drinking, preached by the Puritan Samuel Danforth, reflecting the idea that addiction was characterized by habitual but deliberate engagement in frequent excess. Those who chose to act on their addictions were seen as loving their intoxication too much, but otherwise they have no difference from any other kind of sinner. This link between unhealthy love and addiction has since been repeatedly rediscovered, but it tends to be misunderstood. I'll explore further in chapter 11. Opium eaters like Thomas D. Quincy, who famously wrote his Confessions about his experience in 1821, also spoke of the extensive power and marvelous agency of this drug. He described the high as the panacea of all human woes and the abyss of divine enjoyment. De Quincey gave equally lavish descriptions of the agony of withdrawal, but still concluded that my case is at least a proof that opium, after 17 years of use and an 8 years of abuse of its powers, may still be renounced. However, like many who followed him, the author of what is believed to be the world's first addiction memoir later relapsed, and as his successors would soon do. De Quincey paradoxically both exalted and demonized the drugs, warning of its fatally seductive powers while presenting a story of enjoying then overcoming them. The idea that addiction was a form of chemical slavery became increasingly popular a few decades later. In the middle of the 19th century, it may not have been a coincidence that during the same period the United States was also consumed by debates over race and the actual slave trade. Blatant racism and the idea of bondage have played a role in concepts of addiction and drug policy right from the start. As a result, confronting the role of race in our conceptions of addiction is critical to developing better definitions of the problem, treatment, and policy. The American physician and Declaration of Independence signer Benjamin Rush was among the first to call alcoholism a disease of the will. He first wrote about this notion in the late 1700s, publishing the first edition of this pamphlet, An Inquiry into the Effects of Spirituous Liquors upon the Human Body and Their Influence upon the Happiness of Society in 1784. In this book, he blamed the physical effects of alcohol itself for overwhelming all attempts at controlled drinking in those who drank heavily. Although oddly, he thought the problem was only hard liquor, not beer or wine, but this disease concept did not really catch on until decades later. Ultimately, fueling the prohibition movement towards the turn of the century and thereafter. Intriguingly, Rush was also a leading abolitionist. He founded the first anti slavery society in the United States. However, as with addiction, he saw being black as a disease. He called this illness negritude and thought that it could only be cured by becoming white. He believed this was possible because he was he saw being black as he because it could only be cured by becoming white. He believed this was possible because he'd seen cases of vitiligo, a disease that produces lighter colored patches on darker skin. Rush himself doesn't seem to have linked the disease of negritude with racist stereotypes about the character of African Americans, and the fact that he named both blackness and addictions as diseases does seem to have been a genuine coincidence. It is a telling one, however, because of the way drug policy has always been entwined with race and with ideas of who is one of us and who is one of them. Indeed, it is not at all coincidental that negative personality traits that characterize racist stereotypes are virtually identical to the depraved characteristics said to define people with addiction, from criminal propensities, laziness, promiscuity, violence, and childishness, to deviousness and an inability to tell the truth. These twisted stereotypes have long been used both to promote harsh drug laws and to try to discredit people of all races and cultures with which prohibited substances are associated. Moreover, the selective enforcement of such laws then creates further associations between crime, race, culture, and drugs, producing a vicious cycle. Consequently, the historical roots of addiction in the period of the so called scientific racism still influence our perception today. If you viewed media coverage of crack and heroin addiction spreading to the middle class or read stories written by a white person who claims to be not your typical addict, you are essentially hearing the echoes of the racist origins of contemporary ideas about addiction. The echoes run deep, even among those who think they are not being influenced by them. Our conceptions of addiction, in fact, have been enmeshed with fears about ethnicity, class, and foreigners since the idea was first applied to drug problems and used as a reason to ban substances. Intoxicants preferred by us have always been seen as non drugs, medicines, and tonics, while substances taken by them are tagged as dangerous drugs without legitimate uses. Consequently, addicts cannot be nice people like us. They are scary, bad, crazy people who can only be stopped by extreme measures, or rather, if they are seen as members of stigmatized minorities, we advocate harsh punitive treatment, and if someone like us does turn out to be affected, we see that person as exceptional and deserving of a different and much kinder approach. The first American state laws against cocaine, for example, were passed in the South in the depths of the Jim Crow era. According to historian David Musto, the fear of the cocainized black coincided with the peak of the lynchings. Legal segregation and voting laws, all designed to remove political and social power from him. Southern sheriffs claimed the drugs not only made black men into better marksmen, but they rendered them practically bulletproof, requiring police to use higher caliber weapons. Even worse, it induced black men to rape white women and could be used to lure innocent white women who otherwise would never dream of having interracial affairs. Similarly, state and local laws in California and other western states banning opium in the 1880s were first passed after supporters stoked racist fears about Chinese laborers who built the Transcontinental Railroad in the South. Cocaine was used to allow black men to lay claim to white women. But in the West, virtually identical charges were made against Chinese men and their lascivious, lascivious opium dens. Lascivious opium dens, even though pharmacologically the drugs typically have been nearly opposite effects. Cocaine is a stimulant, opium is a depressant. For example, one law enforcement report then California from California at the time says that the police have found white women and Chinamen side by side under the effects of the drug. A humiliating sight for anyone who has anything left of manhood. Explicitly racist journalism and political campaigning helped drive the passage of the 1914 Harrison Narcotics Act under the guise of a tax law. It made cocaine and opium and its derivatives de facto illegal, with certain exceptions for medical use, while there were other factors like battles over labeling and fights over for control over sales by professional groups like doctors, pharmacists, and industry. Racism was evident throughout the political debate, and the media messaging, even supposedly straight laced publications like the New York Times were not immune. A 1905 New York Times news story was titled Negro Cocaine Evil, and a 1914 op ed proclaimed Negro cocaine fiends Negro cocaine fiends are a new Southern menace. Testifying before Congress in favor of the anti drug law, one expert stated most attacks upon white women of the South are a direct result of cocaine crazed Negro brain. Marijuana prohibition too was deeply influenced by racism. Its main proponent, Harry Anslinger, used racist rhetoric to push through the federal law that effectively banned the drug in 1937. Anslinger was formerly a alcohol agent, prohibition agent who headed the Federal Bureau of Narcotics from its founding until 1962, said plainly that the main reason for cannabis was its effect on the degenerate races. He claimed that reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men, and warned that there are 100,000 marijuana smokers in the US and most are Negroes, Hispanic, Filipinos, entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz, and swing result from marijuana use. The marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others. Although such rhetoric, along with films like the 1936's Reefer Madness, may have been laughable now, it helped create the drug laws we have today. When particular drugs weren't associated with the dangerous classes, however, addiction tended to be seen as a medical problem. For example, before the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act required makers of patent medicines to list their ingredients, heroin, cocaine, and marijuana were frequently in tonics and pills that could simply be purchased at pharmacies. The typical opiate addict at the time was actually a mother and housewife who had become inadvertently dependent on after buying widely marketed remedies that came with no warnings. It's not clear how much of this dependence was simply a medical use for pain and how much was actual addictive behavior. But historical accounts show that some women actually were using the drug to get high or escape. The Eugene O'Neill play Long Day's Journey into Night features one such woman, Mary, as a character. These addicts weren't seen as a menace to society, however, instead, they were patients to be pitied, educated, protected from unscrupulous drug companies, and cared for by doctors. In fact, simply labeling opiate containing medicines cut their use between 25 and 50% in the years after the 1906 law was passed, showing clearly that measures short of criminalization can affect the use of even the most effective addictive drugs, and that education is a powerful part of prevention. As the 20th century continued, however, the ideas about addiction began to change. Earlier, Rush and others had described alcoholism as a disease characterized by a loss of control, one that was caused by exposure to ardent spirits that were destructive to human freedom. The problem was in the drug itself. In this case, alcohol. In this case, alcohol. Anyone exposed could become addicted if they continued drinking heavily for long enough. Though no fault of their own, they argued, not surprisingly, this was the ideology that ultimately helped lead to prohibition, which lasted from 1920 to 1933. After all, if alcohol caused alcoholism and all of the domestic violence, bar fights, poverty, and degradation that was associated with it, banning it would end it or at least significantly reduce these social problems. Notably, as with the passage of other drug laws, racism and prejudice against foreigners, immigrants were critical in ensuring the enactment of prohibition. One of the biggest supporters of the Ku Klux Klan, which was revitalized in the 1920s, in part through its embrace of this cause. One historian wrote that support for the prohibition represented the most important bond between Klansmen throughout the nation, and others have described this group's attacks on bootleggers, and an overlap in membership between the clan and the Anti Saloon League, which was a key group that pushed the legalization that banned alcohol. The racial animus here wasn't just against blacks, however. In fact, it primarily focused on immigrant groups that prohibition supporters linked with excessive drinkings like Germans, Irish people, Jews, and Italians. Of course, the disastrous results of prohibition are now notorious, although it appeared to have some positive effects like reducing alcohol related hospitalizations and cirrhosis deaths initially. The same declines were also seen at the time in countries with temperate movements that did not enact prohibitions. Some insurers estimated that alcoholism rates rose by 300% as prohibition continued. Meanwhile, the murder rate went from 6.5 per 100,000 in 1918 before prohibition to 9.7 per 100,000 in 1933, the year of the repeal, nearly a 50% rise, suggesting that the relationship was likely to be causal. This rate then fell back to 6 per 100,000 in 1942. Perhaps worse, in a less known in a less well-known episode that shows how much stigma Americans can attach to type of the drug use they have decided to hate. Thousands of people, research suggests as many as 10,000 were killed by government attempts to keep people from drinking alcohol used in manufacturing process during prohibition. No one has ever been held to account for these preventable deaths, but in 1926 the Coolidge administration began ordering manufacturers to add poisons like methyl alcohol, gasoline, chloroform, carbolic acid, and acetone to industrial alcohol in an attempt to prevent it being diverted to bootleggers. That year, the New York City alone, 1,200 people were sickened and 400 died as a result. It soon became clear that the law was both unenforceable, and counterproductive. With prohibition's fall, the idea of alcoholism simply as a result of exposure to large amounts of booze began to be discredited as well. Both the repeal movement and Alcoholics Anonymous, which founded in 1935, began to promote a slightly different disease model. Instead of seeing alcoholism as the sole cause of alcoholism, they started to view drinking as a symptom. Now, the problem wasn't merely the substance, it was the user's relationship to the substance. While most people could handle liquor, alcoholics couldn't. They had an allergy to alcohol. Marketing it legal then would allow this group to be treated medically while leaving normal drinkers unmolested and wresting control of the industry and much needed tax dollars away from the mob. These ideas about the failure of the prohibition to arrest addiction are now widely accepted, at least in the case of alcohol. However, they aren't nearly as well established in relation to illegal drugs, even though addiction rates for users of heroin, methamphetamine, and cocaine are comparable to those seen with alcohol, and addiction rates for marijuana are lower. To me, as I lay detoxing, it was obvious that addiction was not seen the way as other illnesses, mental or physical, were. The image I had of an addict was essentially the stranded stereotype, one that I now see as harmful and deceptive. A person who would lie, cheat, steal, and have sex for money, perhaps even kill for just a fix. Of course, I'd seen some drug users around me who behaved that way, at least in terms of lying, prostitution, and stealing. At the time, however, I had no idea where the idea that all people with addiction behave like this comes from. I'd simply accepted this moral model. And since I hadn't been doing things that I thought were wrong to get drugs, I naively saw dealing as helpful because I wanted other people to provide good drugs to me too. I didn't think I fit the picture even as I injected drugs multiple times every day. That is until I found myself considering trying to seduce Beaver. My conception of addiction was also, it must be said, shaped by the fact that when I'd started snorting cocaine, it was generally not viewed as particularly addictive, although this too is hard to believe in the wake of crack and the literally thousands of media stories in the 80s and 90s that described it as the most addictive drug ever discovered. It reveals the devilish difficulty in accurately defining this problem. At the time, what this scientific misunderstanding did, at least in my case, was inadvertently encourage my drug use. In 1982, the Scientific American had described cocaine as being not addictive in the classical sense. I'd read the article either at home where my father subscribed or for a class in at Columbia. The authors Craig Van Dyke and Robert Bick had argued that the behavioral pattern of those who snort cocaine is comparable to that experienced by many people with peanuts and potato chips. It may interfere with other activities of the individual, but it may be a source of enjoyment as well. In other words, snorting coke was no more addictive than junk food. That assertion was made afterward with ridicule and outrage when crack was blamed for skyrocketing crime rates and what looked like addicted skeletons began appearing nightly on the news. Today, many experts argue, in fact, that junk food is at least as addictive as Coke, and the comparison is no longer shocking in light and high prevalence of obesity. Then, however, it was generally seen as absurd and beyond the pale. But what the authors were trying to get at was a contradiction that has been frustrated thinking about addiction since the term was first applied to drug problems in the 1800s. Depressant drugs like alcohol, opium, heroin produce physical dependence. First, a requirement of more drugs simply to achieve the same high tolerance, and then, if heavy use continues for a long time, a physiological need for it to stave off unpleasant withdrawal symptoms like nausea and shakiness. In contrast, stimulants like cocaine and methamphetamine don't cause complete tolerance. In fact, they can have the opposite result, known as sensitization, when some effects actually are greater with lower doses as time goes on. Sadly, for people with addiction, the efforts that get the effects that get larger with a reduced dose are the unpleasant ones like anxiety and paranoia, not the fun ones. Stimulant withdrawal also doesn't make you physically ill like heroin, or alcohol withdrawal does. All the signs can be dismissed as psychological rather than physical, and include things like irritability, craving, depression, and sleep disturbances. The issues around tolerance and the lack of physical signs of dependence like vomiting, diarrhea, stimulant addiction made scientists see stimulant problems as less severe. You might want cocaine or speed, the thinking went. But when you didn't need it like a real heroin junkie, addiction was generally depicted at that time as an ongoing fight against withdrawal, as if it didn't lead to visible withdrawal sickness. A drug wouldn't be too addictive, hence, marijuana, amphetamines, and cocaine were soon were seen as non-addictive, while heroin, alcohol could create real addicts. Physical symptoms were seen as real and measurable. Psychological symptoms were minimized and not to be taken seriously. The fact that both kinds of symptoms ultimately had to be expressed via chemical or structural changes to the brain in order to affect the body was ignored. I took this perspective too. That's why I'd entered the methadone program. I'd thought that simply relieving opioid withdrawal symptoms by slowly tapering the drugs would cure me, and that quitting the cocaine, which had no physical withdrawal symptoms, would be easy. I found out for myself every day in 1988 how wrong and misdirected these ideas were. And so by the time I started detox, I wasn't clear on what addiction was, but at least I know what it was not. That is, addiction isn't just a physical need for a substance to avoid withdrawal, though that doesn't help ma- matters any. Physical withdrawal symptoms are nothing compared to psychological desires. What matters in addiction is what you want or, yes, believe you need, not whether you feel sick or even how sick you feel. During the first 5 previous times I'd made it through physical withdrawal over the course of my opioid addictions, I found that I was the most sick was not when I had the most craving, nearly the opposite was true. I was at greatest risk of taking heroin again when I felt better and decided that withdrawal hadn't been so bad and that I could use occasionally and avoid becoming physically dependent. I'd soon find that the question of whether body or mind matters more and when and where the boundary between mind and brain, mental and physical, is runs through most of the key issues and fault lines in addiction. End chapter 2.